But don't let that mic get
Okay, we are reconvening, so please sit down. It's worth a try. So it's our second talk by a tier student, Matthew Kam. Matthew Kam's advisor is actually John Canny, who I assume is here somewhere or will be here shortly, if not. Matthew is also one of the 2 tier students to get a faculty offer, which is a good sign for ICTD. Matthew's going to start as HCI faculty at Carnegie Mellon, I guess in January? January. So congratulations to him on that. Today he's going to be talking about his dissertation research, which is very much in this sweet spot of ICTD, and I actually love his journey, which I'll get into a little bit, but it's really very much bottom up in multiple iterations, trying to figure out what's going to work for educating children using cell phones. Matthew?
Okay, thanks, Eric. So welcome everybody back from the break. So in today's presentation, I basically have 2 goals. So the first goal is to give you guys a summary of what we have done in the MILI project, which is my dissertation research, over the last 4.5 years. And the second goal is really to go a step up and connect what I'm going to be talking about MILI to some of the topics about partnerships and sustainability, which is the theme for this session. So in a developing country such as India, for example, well, English as a second language is so-called one of the highest learning priorities that rural parents have actually identified for their children. So the reason for that really is that English as a second language is viewed as a ticket to a better life. It is the official language in the workplace for business, and knowing English enables people to actually get mid-level service jobs in areas such as clerical work or teaching that would be a step above subsistence farming. So, and that is partly why you actually see that in places like India, for example, it is actually the low-income parents, including parents who are so-called at the bottom of the caste, people you call the Dalits or the untouchables, who actually place a huge amount of political pressure on states' governments to make English teaching a mandatory part of the curriculum. So this thing about this demand for learning English in India is actually part of a broader global phenomenon that we call power language fluency. So what I mean by this is really that a power language does not really have to be English, but it can also be another widely spoken language, for example, Spanish or Mandarin Chinese, that you would find in developing regions such as Africa, Asia, and Latin America. You have minorities in the, underserved minorities who actually speak a very different language at home from this majority language that is the power language. And knowing the language of power helps to open doors to greater educational, economic, and other opportunities for advancement. So the problem is that even though there is this demand for second language learning in the developing world, it is not actually very well addressed right now. And on this slide, I show some of the national level statistics from surveys that have been conducted in India. So, for example, when I was doing fieldwork at one of the rural schools in India, we had actually interacted with kids who had taken about 3 years of lessons in English. But we find that even after 3 years of English lessons, well, a lot of them could actually struggle and could not actually read every single letter in the alphabet, despite 3 years of lessons. And then at another school that I was working in, we saw that there were 3 teachers at this school of maybe 60 kids. And then on any single day that we were there doing our fieldwork, 1 out of 3 teachers would always be taking turns to go on unofficial leave. Yeah. So really what we saw was that English teaching is really not effective because of teacher absenteeism, and also because the teachers who have to teach English themselves could not communicate with us in English. But we soon saw that there was actually a bigger problem in the sense that even if you could improve the school system, which means the formal educational system, one of the challenges really is that it is actually very difficult to make the school system attain a broader reach. So what I mean by that is that almost 50% of school-going age children in rural areas in India cannot actually go to schools regularly. And that is because they have to help work for the family in agriculture or in the households doing few household chores. So because of that, what we felt was that it would be better to actually approach this problem in a complementary way to formal education. And the way to do that is really to develop games that could actually make the language learning process more enjoyable, more engaging. But at the same time, when these games actually draw on so-called pedagogical principles about second language acquisition, well, this would actually create more effective learning experiences. But I think what is most important really is that programmable cell phones are actually becoming increasingly available in some developing regions, such as rural India. And by actually developing games for such mobile platforms, well, this is actually one way to make English and other kinds of language learning more widely accessible, anytime, anywhere, at places and times that are actually more convenient than schools. So that, in a short statement, is really the whole motivation behind the MILI project. So the challenges really is that, well, you can't really develop such a thing as a one-size-fits-all games that could address all kinds of local language learning needs, because the kinds of adoption ecology that you see is actually very complex in developing regions. And this diagram that looks complicated is only one small part of the formal educational system in India. And it really shows that, well, there's actually some levels of local adaptation that's going on from two different directions. So coming from the top down, well, you really see that every state in India actually has and devises its own set of state-level curriculum for teaching English. So there is already localization going on at the state level. But then when you look from the bottom up direction, well, you actually see that there are many NGOs working in this space who see that rural communities have their own struggles trying to learn the state's syllabus, which is really sometimes beyond the reach of kids living in the villages. So what these NGOs do is that they do another layer of local adaptations themselves to the state's level syllabus to make it more manageable. So you really find that there's all kinds of local adaptations that's going on that varies from location to location. So that is really why, at a very high level, the contributions behind this research project is really to look at how we could develop tools that facilitate this micro-localization of e-learning games. So first we have a framework that helps us to think about how do you actually design games in a way that comprises many different modules, such that you only really need to change modules that you have to change for local context, and then reuse the other ones that are actually continue to be applicable. And of course, in the context of e-learning games, you're actually approaching this problem from two very different angles. So there's this thing about language learning, and so one of our contributions was to look at design patterns that promotes language pedagogy. And then on the other direction, there's this thing about entertainment. And to do that, we actually draw on the game design elements that we have identified in a set of traditional village games. So it's really combining education and entertainment together. So to date, well, we have already conducted 8 rounds of field studies so far. It's not possible for me to really go too much in depth into any of this, and I'll just give a high-level view. So we essentially started out with needs assessment, where we actually go in there just thinking that, you know, we don't have any preconceived idea at that stage about what we're actually going to do, other than we wanted to do something. So we went in there, spent time on the ground to really understand what were some ground-level conditions and problems. And after which, we had a few different ideas about what kinds of technology solutions we could do. But even then, we were not totally sure if any of these ideas would work. And we didn't want to get ourselves too emotionally invested in any of these ideas. So we just used off-the-shelf solutions to mimic some of these approaches, and just to check, you know, at the exploratory level, well, to what extent would some of these ideas work and not work? And it was only after a while that we figured out that, well, maybe cell phones might be one possible platform, and that, oh, English is actually one of the pressing needs that people on the ground have been telling us again and again. So that was when we actually go into doing e-learning games for English learning that run on cell phones. And then more rounds of iterations and field testing. And it's only really at the beginning of this year in 2008 that we got to the stage of doing a large, well, at least some sizable kind of deployment that really has some level of significance. So even though this timeline looks really straight, well, don't get the wrong idea that the whole process was really that smooth, because it's really more characterized as, in each step of the process, it's really more of a 2-step forward and 1-step backward kind of frustrating experience. So one of the principles that we try to use in our research is really to avoid reinventing the wheel. So the way that we do that was actually to look at a sample of commercial language learning applications, and we looked at more than 35 of them, including some of the well-known ones that you guys might be familiar with, like Rosetta Stone and Pimsleur. And then we looked at them and tried to identify what were some of the common patterns that they have used, so that we could reuse some of these patterns as opposed to reinventing the wheel. And this was a very interesting process that really started off some of my learning in a very different directions. And in a way, you could call that one of the kinds of partnerships in terms of multidisciplinary collaboration. Because when I first got into this project, I was really a computer scientist by training, and I realized that it was actually almost impossible for me to even understand what this software were trying to do from a pedagogical value. And that was how I started taking classes in the Graduate School of Education here in Berkeley, and really getting a secondary background to try to understand, how do you actually get the technology to fit with the education part. And that was how in the process I got to do this analysis that was starting to make sense from an educational standpoint. So the next thing was that after we had identified some of the best practices in commercial language learning applications, well, we drew on those practices and then implemented our own e-learning games based on them. And like I said earlier, well, the kinds of competencies that we observed on the ground was really very low level, as in I was talking about kids who couldn't read every letter in the English alphabet after 3 years of lessons. So that was why we targeted very low level English competencies in those games. And then we implemented those games for field testing. So just to foreground the rest of this presentation, well, I should actually add that we had a huge number of undergraduate research assistants who contributed to this project in terms of helping us to do the programming and all kinds of systems development. So what was especially interesting really was that these research assistants were not only Berkeley undergraduates, but they were also undergraduates from India who were studying computer science. So we found that it was actually very useful to have them involved in our project, because we got some extra manpower in the process to help us with the systems development. And I think what was more important really was that, well, there was actually inadequate research opportunities like this in India. So in a way, when we were able to get them engaged and on board in this project, we actually were giving them an outlet for their creativity and their ambition to succeed and achieve. So eventually we got to deploy those 10 games with 3 different communities in India. And so doing those field studies in multiple locations helped us to get a better sense of how different communities vary in different ways. And again, in addition to having partnerships with local undergraduates, it is also very important to actually have local strong relationships with the actual end user communities themselves. So we found that, well, there were some interesting experiences from some of our work in one of the village schools that we did our field tests in. So for example, the kids actually wanted to take us around the village to visit the temple in the village. And then when we initially didn't want to go, well, they lost enthusiasm for the field tests that we were trying to do. And so eventually we decided we have to do that. But what was more interesting really was that it was actually very important to build a very inclusive atmosphere for the user study. So what I mean by inclusiveness really is that, well, when the kids were taking us around the village, well, we actually noticed that there were caste tensions. And I guess the way that we noticed it was that the local undergraduates were very aware of that kind of problems. And they were the guys who brought it up to our attention that, well, when they were taking us to the temple, well, they wanted us to go by a certain route that would actually avoid the dwelling areas of the lower caste people. So of course there were some of the kids in that group who were from the lower caste themselves who were not very happy about the fact. So finally, it was the local undergraduates themselves who advised that, well, on our return journey back from the temple, we should actually walk through the dwelling areas of the lower caste people so that we could actually convey this message that, when we are there to do a user study, well, it is really about the fact that we want to work with everybody and we treat everybody equally. So So we actually found that, well, even though the local undergraduates were a great help to us in terms of systems development, well, I think a greater resource that they actually provided eventually was their familiarity with the local languages, the local culture, and the social norms that really mattered in those rural areas. Well, of course, on the flip side, I think the challenge that we had in terms of working with local undergraduates is that they came from a very different background. Because my background in computer science is actually human-computer interaction. So that involves a lot of working with user interfaces and understanding the social phenomenon around how people use technology. And that is actually a topic that is not very well covered in traditional engineering curriculums in places like India, where engineering syllabus is still very traditional. So part of the challenge really was that we had to actually spend a lot of time mentoring local undergraduates to pick up some of this foundational material that is not really covered locally. But on the whole, I think it was a very great and satisfying experience for me and for them also. So just one more last point on this slide, which is, well, when we selected local undergraduates to work with us, I guess it wasn't really so much on the basis of getting them involved by selecting people who had high grades or good competencies in engineering. Rather, the way we selected was that, well, in some of those local universities in India, well, there's this graduation requirement that's called rural internships. So they actually have to do a rural internship with an NGO in their first summer in order to graduate. And so we actually looked at what they did for their rural internships. And, some of these guys actually spent like 2 entire months in one summer in some villages doing baseline assessments or something. So we felt that those was a very good preparation for getting them ready to do the kinds of field work that our research group does. Okay, so what we found eventually was that, well, back to the project. So we found that the kids actually enjoyed the games to the extent that, they were actually showing off the screens that showed that they had won some levels. Yeah, but I think what was more important was that, well, even though we came in at that stage, and that was still a fairly early stage in the project, where some of the games that we developed were actually demonstrating learning gains as measured on pre and post tests. The challenge for us really was that it was taking us a lot of efforts to actually explain how those games work to the village children. And then we eventually realized that that was because the kinds of web games that we designed for them to play were actually very Western in their designs, that subconsciously took what we knew about Western video games and all those biases just went into those designs. So we figured that, well, when those games that we had were taking a long time for village children to understand, we needed to actually design games that better match the kinds of expectations and understandings that they have about traditional village games. So as a result of that led us to really do a study of what some of the traditional village games are. And this is one example of a traditional village games that is very different qualitatively from electronic games. So in total, we actually studied 28 of those traditional games that the kids in villages play. And one very interesting thing was that the kinds of village games that they play is also a marker of social identity, in the sense that when we first asked them to reenact the kinds of games that they play every day in villages, well, the kids were actually very reluctant to show us what those games are. And they kept showing us the games that look like very urban kinds of variations. And again, it was the local undergraduates who noticed that kind of biases. And then we tried to coax the kids, that, well, there's nothing wrong in telling us more about the kinds of rural games that they play. And there's no need to be, shy about letting us know about that, because we are really there to learn about how those games work. So eventually, well, after the local undergrads did all kinds of coaching and told them about all kinds of rural games that they themselves knew, well, I think we got the kids to open up, and eventually we started to learn what were the actual village and rural kinds of games that they played. So, and then based on our analysis of the elements in those traditional village games, well, the next thing we do was really try to understand how those games that they are familiar with are qualitatively very different from the kinds of contemporary Western video games that we are all used to. So the way that we do it was really to look at this reference called by Bjork and Holopainen. So that essentially is a compendium of almost 300 design patterns about games today. So we take that as a representative sample of the most common features in games today, and then we compare this set of features against the kinds of elements that you see in the traditional village games, just to understand what were some of those areas that were different. So, and then, okay, so after we've actually gotten a better sense of the traditional games, well, we got on to the next step of the project, where we were really trying to do a larger scale pilot deployment. And that is actually very important in a context of so-called kind of a language learning project, because learning any languages actually is a time-consuming process. So you can't really learn something in a short period of time. So for us to do this, well, that was when we really realized that it got into a lot of complications when we tried to do this. So previously, when we tried to do a small-scale pilots, that was easy because we were just spending a couple of weeks on the ground. But this time, you needed to actually be able to do a pilot that lasts us one entire semester. So in order to do that, it really means at first, you need to actually get very serious into curriculum development. Okay, so to do that well, we actually engaged the services of a local English teacher. So again, that was a kind of a partnership we have with locals to develop a substantial curriculum that would be locally relevant and address local language learning needs. But more importantly, because you actually needed to hire local guys to run these pilots in our absence, that was where a lot of the complications come. Because an institution like Berkeley can't really be paying their salaries directly. And then on the other hand, so we needed to transfer a sum of money to India to an NGO partner. And that was when we realized that it got very complicated because not every NGO is actually approved by the Indian government to receive money from abroad. And that is actually part of the national federal government's precautions against anti-money laundering. So eventually, I think we were lucky that one of our partners could actually, was set up to do that kind of stuff. And so we managed to transfer that sum of money eventually. But it took a 15-month-long kind of process and to sign a memorandum of understanding. So I'll just briefly mention that, yes, we got some post-test gains on that study. So I'll skip some of this and just go straight to just mentioning what are some of the later stuff that we want to do. So for 2009, well, the next step would really be thinking about, well, now that we've done a one-semester pilot in a classroom setting, how do we actually expand that to a context that is out of school so that we could make language learning more accessible? And again, I think one of the advantages of doing this is that, with local undergraduates, we were actually able to make it possible for them, starting next spring, to actually do this as part of their senior honors thesis requirement. So this really means that we would actually have people stationed on the ground who have learned some of the kind of research methodologies from us and actually be able to apply that in the context of a real research project that sometimes people like us can't be stationed down there to do. And of course, the next step is really to look at expansions not only in India but also in the US. And so the brief story about sustainability, which is really one of the last few slides I have, is really to say that, when I first started this project, I think I was just under that kind of impression that, I'm just coming in there as somebody who's going to be developing a system. And then eventually I realized that it's more complicated than a system, and then you actually need to develop local content as well. And a step further is really that, it's only at this point, I guess, after working on this for 4.5 years, that I realized that even having a local content development process is insufficient, because it's really about building this whole broader ecosystem, that has different kinds of parties involved, not only in actually creating the content, but in distributing it and in also implementing these kinds of interventions on the ground. So something that I could just say very briefly about sustainability is that we actually have to look at the whole broader ecosystem. As in terms of what we do as ICTD researchers, and thinking about what are the different elements in place already and what else we have to do. So just to summarize the takeaways, well, I believe that in the process of our research projects in the last 4.5 years, well, there's still a lot that we don't know and we still have to learn. But I think what some of us have actually started to get a better sense of appreciation for is that when we talk about NGOs, I think many of us tend to think of NGO size in terms of metrics like the number of people they have, or the amount of funding that they have, or the scale of their operations. But I just want to suggest that another way to think about the scale of an NGO is really to think about the kinds of regulatory approvals that they have already received from governments to actually get involved in cross-border transactions, for example, like receiving money from abroad, because that would be one of the impediments to scaling up a research project. And of course, for local team members, undergraduates in developing countries are sometimes a great resource that I think are currently underutilized. So with that, I just want to give a quick thank you to my thesis committee in computer science and education. So this itself is a multidisciplinary project. And so you see a huge list of team members' names because we have a lot of guys both in Berkeley and India who work on this. And also, various NGO partners who have helped us along the way to get to where we are today. So with that, these are some more references in case you need more details on the project. And thank you very much.
We have some time for questions. Can you get the mic on? What was that?
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. One quick question. Why mobile phone as the technology to help children? And what is the current statistic about children use of mobile phone, especially in rural areas? Thank you.
Okay, good question. Yeah, so I think I was a bit fast in covering that just now. So the whole motivation behind using the cell phone is that it is a so-called portable device. So when students could actually make use of cell phones to get access to language learning materials in places and times that are more convenient than schools, well, this is essentially a way to actually broaden the reach of literacy. So next, to the second part of the question about cell phone ownership. So I believe the last statistics I have, which is a bit outdated, and I got these statistics, by the way, from one of the wireless carriers in India. So in rural areas, well, at least 1 or 2 years ago, the statistic was something like 8 out of every 100 folks in the rural areas will have a cell phone. But this number is actually much bigger than you think, because once you multiply that 8 out of 100 by maybe 7 people in a household, well, this comes out to something like a 50%, well, or close to a 50% kind of accessibility. And then based on our own field studies, well, we saw that the number is actually much higher. So I can quote some of the experiences that we've seen on the ground. So for example, I talked about that pilot that we did in spring 2008 with 27 kids. And so out of those 27 kids, 25 of them actually own cell phones, and 25 of them actually come from households that own at least 1 or more cell phones. So there were actually 2 households that own more than 1 cell phone. And when you look at the kinds of phones that they own, well, a minority of them actually own higher end phones than what you expect, monochrome screens. So a couple of them actually own cell phones that have color screens, or even cell phones that have built-in cameras. So we really see that, at least anecdotally, well, it's actually quite feasible to think about using cell phones as a platform for learning in some of these regions, maybe not all.
Question about the PACE framework. Could you talk a little bit more about building development communities around it?
Okay, yeah, good point. Okay, so the PACE framework is really a framework where, PACE stands for different elements in a framework. So the whole basic idea behind PACE really is that when you think about a lot of e-learning software out there today, what's really happening is that you can actually break up the software into different types of components at different levels. So for example, so the software has different parts, like the user interface, the interaction design level that involves the user interacting with it, the kinds of pedagogical principles that go in there, and the actual curriculum that thing is trying to teach. So I'm not trying to say that it's possible to do a complete separation all the time, but in most cases you can actually separate to such an extent that, for example, if you're trying to teach the same material for different kinds of so-called communities, you could actually change you could reuse a lot of the same curriculum, but just make some modifications to the user interface and to the interaction design, in terms of doing local adaptations for different ages for the learners, or different kinds of cultural knowledge that they have to make it more culturally relevant.
Hi, could you comment a bit on the some of the incentives, be it economics or otherwise, for the local content developers to produce those games?
Okay, that's a very good question, okay? Because right now, it's not clear to me if this is something that can be done by the private sector. And, okay, so I can go back to that slide. But there's actually one slide I had that has a list of different types of so-called content developers. And you find that a huge proportion of them are, well, I would say that all of them are actually non-profit. So you find that there's some of them, they are funded by governments, like for example, you know, the Institutes for English in India, government funded. You have other guys who are funded by philanthropic sources, meaning so-called philanthropies who have money to contribute for international development, and they set up their own foundations. So that would be Pratham and Ajim Premji Foundation. Well, you also have non-profits like the Indian branch of Sesame Street that also you know, has its own revenue model for selling its own products, and then you generate, feeding that back into content development. So really, I think the whole way to view this is that, well, it's not clear if there's a profit motive that would actually be enough of an incentive to do this, but we can see that there are non-profit organizations that actually are working on content development in the context of India at least.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew.
Okay, thanks.